A cold, slicing sound cut through the stillness of the first-class cabin. The first-class boarding pass was torn in half, right in front of Marcus Hale, like a sentence being handed down. The pieces fluttered, twisted in the air-conditioned draft, then landed on the leather tip of his shoe. That was the moment everyone knew they were about to throw out the wrong man. Linda Carver, a 45-year-old flight attendant, whose face had been sharpened by time and bitterness, stood blocking the aisle. Her back was rigid like steel, her narrowed eyes brimming with judgment. She didn't need to shout. Her voice was sharp, cold, and loud enough to turn the entire cabin into an arena. "I told you already. This seat is not for you." No one spoke, but every gaze around him felt like a needle. Watching, judging, waiting for the explosion. Marcus bent down to pick up the torn halves. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from realizing exactly what was happening, something he had faced many times in his life, but never grew numb to. A kick to his dignity, wrapped in a Navy uniform. The light streaming through the window carved out every line on Marcus's face, the face of a man who understood too well what it meant to stay silent to survive. But today he would not be silent. He could not be. Time slowed. The invisible camera swept across the faces of the passengers. The middle-aged man in 2A staring wide-eyed but too afraid to intervene, the young woman in 3D frozen mid-sip. Her champagne tilted dangerously, a mother clutching her child, turning her face away from the tension she couldn't bear to watch. They all knew what was happening. They all knew what no one dared to say. Marcus straightened. He wasn't imposing or towering, but his presence alert, controlled, and quietly powerful suddenly made the luxurious cabin feel too small for the truth rising in it. He shouldn't have had to prove anything, but in this space he had to prove everything. The engine hummed faintly from outside, vibrating through the fuselage, but the tremor inside first class came from something else. From the storm beginning to gather around Marcus Hale, the CEO of Hale Cyber Systems, the man scheduled to sign a $500 million government contract that very afternoon. Not that anyone here knew, and Linda Carver certainly didn't care. The camera zoomed in on Linda, her face twisted with the dangerous confidence of someone convinced she was right. "You don't belong here," she said, each word slicing through the air, no matter how hard you try to look like you do. The sentence held no explicit racial slur, but it carried the full weight of one. Marcus looked at her. He didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "What did you just do?" A question soft in tone, but sharp enough to pull a pin. Linda stepped closer. Her breath smelled of stale coffee and contempt. "I am doing my job, and you will be removed from this aircraft if you continue to be non-compliant." The word non-compliant dropped heavily like a stone, the kind of label that could destroy a life the moment it was placed on the right person in the wrong moment. The cabin fell silent, not out of respect, but fear. Fear of being the next target. Marcus looked down at his suitcase, the one that had followed him through dozens of meetings, generations of contracts, every journey of his life as a businessman. He leaned down to unzip it when thud. Linda's foot slammed into the suitcase, a cruel, deliberate kick that left a dent on the leather, like the imprint of hatred. The suitcase burst open documents, scattering like snow across the polished floor of the cabin. Contracts worth hundreds of millions, briefing papers for the Security Council, classified government files, all lay at the feet of a woman who was shaking with rage. A passenger gasped. Another covered their mouth. The entire cabin held its breath. Linda bent down and picked up a family photo. Marcus and his daughter in a park on an autumn day. She examined it, then tore it in half with the same ease she would tear a tissue. Trying to pretend you have a happy family. Keep lying to yourself. The two halves drifted down. One landed on Marcus's cheek. The other slid onto the carpet. The camera followed each falling piece before snapping back to his face. His eyes, usually warm and composed, were now cold as tempered steel. So cold the air around him seemed to contract. He didn't shout. He didn't fight back. He didn't lose control. His silence was more frightening than any scream. Linda couldn't stand that he didn't crumble. "I will report you for a security violation," she snapped. "You will be banned from flying. You will never step into first class again." The pace quickened. Tension stacked upon tension. Marcus knelt to pick up his documents. His fingers brushed a contract marked "Classified," now stamped with a shoe print. A sharp pain tightened in his chest, not because the documents were damaged, but because the truth had revealed itself. Some people didn't care who he was, only who he wasn't. Linda turned and shouted into the cabin. "We have a non-compliant passenger in first class. Call security immediately." The murmurs spiked. Passengers recoiled as if Marcus were a threat. A man muttered, "He must have done something." A woman pulled her son closer. The injustice was blatant, undeniable, burning in the space they all shared. Yet no one stood up. The camera spun in a slow, 360-degree arc around Marcus, a man kneeling in the aisle, documents scattered like the ashes of dignity. Light from the window cast a pale reflection on him, like a chilling omen. They thought they were tearing him down, but they were about to touch the worst possible person. Linda bent down again, her voice sharp enough to freeze the air. "I will end this, and believe me, you will never forget this day." Marcus lifted his gaze. The camera zoomed in tight. His eyes were not angry, not afraid. Only one thing filled them, a calmness so complete it felt like the center of a storm. He rose, slowly, precisely, as if making a decision that had long been waiting inside him. He picked up his phone, his hand steady as stone. Linda barked a laugh full of contempt. "Who are you calling? Some cheap lawyer? A friend? No one is coming to save you." Marcus tapped a familiar number. The ringing echoed. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Then a man's voice came through, the voice of Richard Coleman, the CEO of North Star Airways, the man who owned the airline Marcus was standing on. The cabin went silent enough to hear breathing. Marcus raised the phone, his voice low and sharp. "Richard, this is Marcus Hale. Your team has just made a very big mistake." Marcus held the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Linda, who stood in front of him, like a wall built from arrogance and prejudice. Richard Coleman's voice came through the line, clearly deep, commanding, and powerful enough to make the entire cabin seem to shrink. Marcus spoke slowly, deliberately, letting each word drop like evidence, making sure every person in first class heard it. "I am standing on your airline's aircraft, and your team has just destroyed classified government documents, insulted me, fabricated a live stream, and called security to detain me." The cabin froze. No one dared to move. Richard was silent for a single beat. Then his voice exploded through the speaker, booming all the way to the last row, like thunder ripping open a quiet afternoon. They did what Linda stumbled back a step, as if struck by sound. Several passengers covered their mouths. Others began recording again. Richard demanded the call be put on speaker so he could address the entire crew. Marcus switched to speaker mode. Richard Coleman, CEO of North Star Airways, spoke clearly, each word sharp and precise like a verdict. All crew members on this flight, listen carefully. The man you are insulting is Marcus Hale, CEO of Hale Cyber Systems, the single largest client of this airline, contributing more than $50 million in revenue every year. Linda froze. Her face went pale. Her lips trembled. Her throat tightened as if she had swallowed ice. The passengers who had shrunk back earlier now leaned forward, watching destiny twist in real time. Richard continued his voice as sharp as a surgeon's blade. And more importantly, he is on his way to a meeting to sign a $500 million government contract, a contract that directly impacts our company's reputation. Every passenger heard it. A wave of whispers spread through the cabin. The two security officers who had approached to restrain Marcus immediately stopped. One of them stared at Marcus as if he had just transformed into one of the most important figures in the country. Richard issued his next order. No one touches him. No one holds him for even a second longer. Bring the senior operations team to the gate immediately. I am on my way to the airport. Linda opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She wanted to deny, to justify, to scream that she didn't know, but no words escaped. The truth was unfolding too fast, too brutally, too precisely. A passenger in row 3 whispered what everyone else was thinking. My God, she just destroyed her own career. Marcus bent down and collected the scattered documents. He was not frantic, not shaken. Every movement was filled with the calm of someone who knew he had just stepped into a new phase of the game where he was no longer the victim. He was the center. The phone remained on speaker. Richard's voice dropped lower, but still carried an authority that made every hair on the back of the neck stand up. Marcus, do not move from your spot. I want to see these people explain themselves with my own eyes. Marcus replied, with a voice deep, composed, yet sharp enough to make Linda step back again. I will stay right here, and they will answer for everything they have done. Linda looked around, desperate for someone, anyone to take her side. But no one did. Even her colleagues lowered their heads to avoid her gaze, because at this moment there was no doubt who was right and who was wrong. Only one thought echoed in the minds of everyone aboard. They had touched the wrong man, and the price would not be small. The air in the first-class cabin thickened like a room drained of oxygen. Linda drew in a shaky breath, struggling to swallow the rising panic in her throat. But the silence around her was more brutal than any accusation. The entire cabin watched her like a person standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the slightest breeze to send her plunging into the abyss. The cockpit door swung open. Captain Raymond Holt stepped out his uniform, perfectly pressed his face, flushed red from confusion, and the unmistakable sense that something catastrophic was unfolding. He opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus's phone was still on speaker, and Richard's voice cut through the cabin like a formal charge. Raymond, I know you can hear me. I am ordering the immediate suspension of the entire first-class crew until I arrive. No one is to leave, and no one is to make any decisions on their own. This is a direct order from the CEO. Captain Holt froze. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He lifted his gaze to Linda, as if seeing the cause of a major aviation incident about to destroy multiple careers. His voice trembled. What exactly happened here? No one answered, only the sound of phones recording. And Marcus, standing still at the center of the storm, radiating a calm that was more terrifying than anger. Linda dragged in a breath, trying to salvage the authority that had just collapsed beneath her. I followed protocol. Marcus lifted his head, his eyes sharp as a blade. Do not lie. Everything is being recorded. There are at least 10 videos in this cabin, all showing the opposite of what you are about to claim. Linda stuttered. The captain turned to the young flight attendant, standing at the side of the cabin, the one who had been watching the entire ordeal with growing dread. Grace, what did you see? Grace closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with a decision. A decision she knew would end someone's career, but if she stayed silent, she would be complicit for the rest of her life. Linda kicked the passenger's suitcase. She tore his boarding pass. She made up that he threatened her. And she live-streamed it all. A furious wave of whispers erupted like sparks hitting dry grass. Linda spun toward Grace, eyes wide, voice cracking. You betray me! Grace stepped back, her hands trembling, but her voice firm. I betray wrongdoing, not people. Marcus looked at Linda. No anger, no satisfaction. Only the raw truth reflected in his eyes, and the collapse of a person being forced to face herself. Captain Holt turned to Marcus. His voice shrank heavy with shame. Mr. Hale, I am deeply sorry. My crew was completely in the wrong. An older passenger, in seat 2A, spoke up, his voice trembling with outrage. I have flown hundreds of times in my life. I have never seen a flight attendant behave like this. She should be fired immediately. A young woman raised her phone high. I recorded everything from the moment she kicked his suitcase. I am willing to testify if needed. Voices of agreement swelled through the cabin like a rising tide. Linda stood frozen. Her jaw quivered, her eyes red, her face as pale as ash. She looked like a soldier stripped of every weapon on the battlefield. Her entire life, she had leaned on her uniform for power. Now that same uniform was the chain dragging her down. The phone remained on speaker. Richard's voice returned each word, glacial and merciless. I have watched the videos the passengers sent to operations. I am walking to the gate right now. And I want Linda Carver seated exactly where she is. She is not to move, not to speak, and she will wait for disciplinary action directly from me. Linda had to grab a seat back to keep from collapsing. The captain gave a small nod. She understood. Sit down. She couldn't argue anymore. She had nothing left to cling to. She sank into the nearest empty seat, her hands clasped together, knuckles turning white. Every whisper, every stare, every phone recording felt like hands tightening around her throat. Marcus scanned the cabin. A wave of silent respect passed through the room. Everyone now understood he was not an ordinary man. Not someone to be stepped on. Not someone who would let truth be twisted. He spoke slowly, his voice slicing through the thick air like a blade. None of you defended me. You defended the truth. And truth is the one thing this flight has been missing. Passengers bowed their heads. Some nodded slightly. Some could not meet his eyes because they were ashamed on her behalf. The captain stepped closer to Marcus, his voice heavy like a confession. Mr. Hale, Mr. Coleman has ordered the flight grounded and the entire executive team brought here. Marcus cut him off with a calm, razor-edged look that made the seasoned captain swallow hard. I am not going anywhere. I will stand here, and I will wait for them. No one dared ask him to move. No one dared touch him. No one dared suggest anything. Linda held her head in both hands. All she could hear was the hum of the air conditioner and her own frantic heartbeat. Every passing second felt like a new indictment. The aircraft door opened again. Urgent footsteps echoed from the jet bridge. A group of executives in black suits entered their faces, tight as if walking into a national crisis meeting. In that moment, everyone in first class understood one clear and undeniable truth. The storm Linda Carver created had reached the highest levels of power, and what was about to fall on her head was no longer consequence. It was judgment. The executive team entered the first-class cabin like a crisis unit rushing into a red-level emergency. But there was no fire here, only a man standing tall amid scattered, trampled documents and a flight attendant shrinking into her seat like a fading light bulb. No one needed instructions to know who the victim was and who the perpetrator was. Richard Coleman appeared behind them, stepping off the jet bridge as he removed his glasses, his face hardened by the kind of anger forged through years of running a massive airline empire. He did not walk quickly, but every step felt like a blade striking the floor. The silence split the cabin into two worlds, one bowing its head, one trembling. Linda heard those footsteps and understood. This was not a meeting to explain. This was a meeting to end her. Richard stepped in his gaze, sweeping across the entire cabin. He saw the suitcase with its broken lock, the laptop under the seat, the shredded, classified documents. He did not ask who did it. He did not need to. Every piece of evidence lay exposed under the bright cabin lights. He stopped in front of Marcus. The two men looked at each other, one representing the dignity that had been trampled, the other representing the entire system that had made the worst mistake in the company's history. Richard gave a small nod, a silent apology heavier than words. Marcus returned it with a calmness that made several people shiver. Richard turned. His eyes froze when they landed on Linda Carver. She shot up on instinct, but her knees buckled from fear. She tried to speak, but her voice fractured like glass hitting the floor. "Sir, I silence." One word, sharp as a death sentence. Linda shut her mouth instantly. Fear washed over her face, like darkness swallowing the last light at the end of a hallway. Richard took a single step toward her. The entire cabin could hear his breathing, short, heavy, filled with the fury of a man whose company had just been dragged through the mud in front of millions. He asked, his voice low but powerful enough to crush the air around them. "Do you comprehend what you have done?" Linda shook violently. "I was just following protocol wrong." Every syllable from Richard landed like nails being hammered into a coffin. Following protocol never includes kicking a passenger's luggage. It never includes tearing a boarding pass. It never includes fabricating a threat to have security restrain an innocent person. And it certainly never includes live streaming lies about our largest client for cheap attention. Linda squeezed her eyes shut, as if darkness could erase the disaster unfolding. But she still heard the furious whispers from passengers. She still heard the phones recording, capturing the final seconds of her career. Richard did not look at her for another second. He turned to the executive team. Collect every video from the passengers. File an incident report immediately. Suspend the entire first-class crew. And call legal. I want a full briefing in 30 minutes. A young manager flinched. "Yes, sir. Right away." Richard looked back at Marcus. His voice softened, but the weight of it multiplied tenfold. "I apologize for everything you had to endure. These people have damaged you, the mission you are carrying out, and my airline's reputation. I will not let this pass quietly. You have my word." Marcus nodded, his eyes cold, yet respectful. "I believe you." Linda took a half step forward, trying desperately to salvage the last pieces of her collapsing world. Mr. Coleman, I didn't know who he was. Richard spun around. Not knowing who he is does not give you the right to treat any passenger like garbage. Not knowing who he is not an excuse. It is evidence. Evidence that you should never have been given authority for even one more minute. Linda choked. Tears spilled down her face, but no one reacted. These were not tears of remorse. These were tears of collapse. Richard delivered the order, his voice flat, stripped of emotion. Escort Ms. Carver off the aircraft. Collect her badge access card and all system privileges immediately. 2 security officers stepped forward. Linda backed away, mouth opening and closing like a stranded fish. No, please, I have a child. Marcus remained still. He did not speak. He did not interfere. He did not need to. Justice was unfolding on its own. Passengers watched as Linda was escorted out her steps, dragging like someone walking toward a life sentence. When her silhouette disappeared behind the door, no one sighed in relief. Because no one believed this was the end, Richard turned back to Marcus. Do you want to continue the flight, or shall I arrange a private jet immediately? Marcus answered, with a voice deep, crisp, and cold as metal in flame. I want them to understand the consequences, and I want everyone to stay and listen. Richard nodded slowly. Every person in first class knew they were about to witness something far bigger than an act of discrimination, bigger than an argument, bigger than a crew. They were about to witness a system being forced to look in the mirror. Richard signaled for the management team to step aside. He needed to speak directly with Marcus, without hierarchy, without protocol, without filters. The entire flight crew stood lined up, their backs, stiff as if held upright by steel wires. No passenger dared to move. The first-class cabin fell into a heavy silence so dense that even breathing too loudly felt like committing a crime. Marcus did not sit. He stood in the aisle, his hands by his sides, not angry, not playing the victim. Yet that calmness only made everyone more tense. It was the calm of a man who knew the ace was in his hand, the calm of someone who had just proven that silence could cut sharper than any blade. Richard began speaking, his voice low and weighty, like thunder preparing to strike the ground. Marcus, you have the right to demand anything: compensation, disciplinary action, lawsuits, a federal investigation. My airline will take full responsibility, but I want to hear from you. What do you want to happen next? Every gaze shifted to Marcus. Someone swallowed hard. Someone clenched their hands. Someone forgot to blink. Everyone knew his answer would determine not only Linda's fate, but the fate of the airline, the crew, the entire system. Marcus looked directly at Richard, then at each member of the crew. His gaze lingered longest on those who had remained silent, while Linda humiliated him, as if asking them a single unspoken question. When you saw what was wrong, why did none of you stand up? He drew in a short, sharp breath. I want them to be held accountable. Not for me. For anyone else who could go through what I did, but does not have the power to protect themselves. One sentence. And the cabin shook like the foundation of an entire industry had been struck. Richard nodded once, slowly, heavily, as if carving that answer into stone. It was not a request for revenge. It was a verdict for a broken system. The crew lowered their heads, some biting their lips, some gripping their hands together as if bracing for the hammer of justice. But Marcus was not finished. He turned, facing the passengers. The cabin lights cast a glow around his temples like a quiet spotlight, illuminating the protagonist of a grand stage. He did not raise his voice, but each word hit the air like a hammer against steel. If it weren't for your videos, I would be detained. I would be banned from flying. I would be labeled a dangerous passenger. No one would believe me. The system would not believe me. But you saw the truth, and you preserved it. A woman in row 3 tightened her grip on her phone. An elderly man in row 2 bowed his head. A young man in row 4 clenched his jaw, his face flushing with shame that he had stayed silent. Marcus stepped toward them. Each measured step forced everyone to confront themselves. You all just witnessed one thing. A single sentence from someone in uniform can destroy a life. One false report can ruin a person's dignity. And if you had not recorded it, the truth would have died right here on this cabin floor. A passenger could not hold back and spoke up. We are sorry. We should have stood up sooner. Marcus looked at them, his gaze deep and cold, but without personal blame. None of you are at fault. The fault lies in a system that allows someone like her to hold enough power to believe she can strip another person of their dignity without consequence. Linda broke down, sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking as if about to collapse. But no one moved. No one comforted her. Because these were not the tears of remorse, they were the tears of someone finally facing the consequences she created herself. Richard stepped forward, standing beside Marcus, not as a superior, but as a witness. Say it, Marcus. I will do exactly what you ask. Marcus turned, slightly his eyes, piercing through Linda's last fragments of denial. I want an independent investigation. I want every complaint ignored in the past to be reviewed. I want full retraining of the system made mandatory. And I want to ensure that no one after me suffers this again, whether they are rich or poor, white or black. The cabin fell into absolute stillness. The air felt stretched to its limit. Richard answered each word as solid as a seal on a decree. You will have all of it. Marcus nodded. It was not satisfaction. It was acknowledgement. A cold, proud, powerful confirmation, as if he had just signed a sentence rather than made a request. The management team behind Richard scrambled to take notes, their hands trembling. They understood what Marcus demanded would not only reshape this airline, it would ripple through the entire aviation industry. And no one had the authority to refuse. A passenger's voice pierced the silence. He just spoke for all of us, for every person who has ever been treated unfairly with no voice. Marcus lifted his eyes toward the cabin ceiling, the white lights reflecting in his gaze. This is not the first time I have lived through something like this. But it will be the last time I let it happen in front of me, without creating change. No one breathed, no one moved, and in that moment no one saw Marcus as the humiliated passenger anymore. They saw him as what he truly was, a man standing in the face of injustice and refusing to bow. A soft announcement echoed from the aircraft door, notifying that the airport's high-level security unit had arrived at the gate. But no one moved. No one wanted to miss the moment when the balance of power continued to tilt toward the truth. The tension was so thick that any slight movement felt like it could detonate the entire scene. 2 senior security officers stepped into first class, not the type who handled minor disruptions. This was the crisis response unit, black vests, metal name plates gleaming coldly. They did not look at Marcus. They did not need to. They immediately knew he was not the problem. Their eyes locked on Linda with the instinctive precision of people identifying the source of a threat to the system. She jumped to her feet, then stumbled backward into a seat, hands trembling uncontrollably. I didn't do anything serious. I was misunderstood. Those videos, they are not clear. One officer cut her off, his voice rigid like a security lock. We have seen them all, and they are clearer than any explanation you could give. Linda collapsed into the seat as if her body had lost all strength. Her throat released a distorted sob. It was not a sight that inspired sympathy. It was a sight of exposure. Richard stepped forward to the lead officer. I request that this incident be formally recorded as abuse of authority, violation of security protocol, and falsification of a passenger report. Legal will be involved immediately. The officer nodded. We already have the report prepared, and we would like to take witness statements right here before relocation. The entire cabin erupted with voices of agreement, unified like a pledge. An elderly man stood up first. I saw her kick his suitcase. That was not an accident. This was not a moment of losing composure. This was intentional harm. A young woman in row 3 raised her phone. I have the full video, from the moment she started yelling until the live stream. A businessman wearing glasses in row 1 looked at Marcus and said, "If he had not stayed calm, someone would have been hurt." I am willing to testify. Linda took each statement, like waves crashing down on her. She tried to stand, but her voice snapped like a broken guitar string. Marcus, he made me afraid. Marcus turned his head and looked at her. One look without words was enough to choke every lie in her throat. Linda froze. She knew no one believed her anymore. There was no ground left beneath her feet. A security officer stepped up to Marcus. "Mr. Hale, we need your statement to complete the report. If you prefer, we can move to a VIP room for privacy." Marcus answered without hesitation. "I will speak here." The response drew everyone's attention. He did not want a closed room. He did not want the truth relocated, softened or shrunk. He wanted everything said in front of the people who witnessed the injustice. Passengers nodded subtly. They understood exactly what he wanted: complete transparency. Marcus stepped into the center of the cabin, standing tall, his voice deep, steady, not angry, but weighted with the experience of someone who had carried far heavier burdens. Flight attendant Linda Carver approached me with hostility the moment I touched the overhead compartment. She issued unlawful commands, failed to verify information, didn't check my boarding pass. She insulted me, damaged my property, spread false information, and deliberately created a situation to call security based on a fabricated threat. A security officer asked, "Do you feel you were targeted for personal reasons?" Marcus answered instantly. It was not a feeling. It was an obvious fact. Linda's body crumpled further, her hand covering her mouth as her shoulders shook, but no one turned toward her. This was not a moment for comfort. This was the moment the truth reclaimed its place. The officer nodded and recorded his statement. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." Richard stood beside Marcus like a wall of authority guarding his dignity. "I want this report forwarded directly to the Federal Executive Board. Both the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Transportation will receive the full file today. Our airline will cooperate completely." Linda gasped. "Federal, no, it cannot." Richard did not look at her. "You spread false information about a passenger. You triggered an emergency security protocol based on fabrication. And you live-streamed the incident to provoke public reaction. Did you think this would stay internal?" The fear in Linda's eyes was no longer fear of losing her job. It was fear of losing her freedom. One passenger whispered, "She thought she was dealing with an ordinary man." She had no idea who she was provoking. Marcus remained still, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the cabin. He was not seeking revenge. He was not trying to humiliate anyone. He simply wanted what was right to be done to the fullest extent. But that calmness was exactly what made his strength unmistakable. The lead officer concluded, Mr. Hale, "We confirm that you did not violate any regulation. All accusations from Ms. Carver will be nullified immediately." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the cabin, soft but sharp like cold wind cutting through the fuselage. Marcus nodded. A single nod that felt like it lifted the crushing weight from the entire space. But no one in the cabin knew that what they had just witnessed was still only the beginning of a chain reaction that would shake the entire aviation industry. Because Marcus was not standing up for himself alone. He was opening the door for thousands of people who had been treated the same way without the power to do anything about it, and the system was about to face what it had avoided for far too long. A senior manager stepped forward, his face tight, like a stretched wire gripping the iPad that held all the passenger videos. He approached Richard and Marcus, his voice low but precise, like reporting the scene of a major accident. Everything aligns. There is not a single conflicting clip. Flight attendant Carver's actions were recorded from 5 different angles. The severity exceeds anything we imagined at first. Linda heard every word, and each one dragged her deeper into the dark pit, opening beneath her feet. She clutched the seat edge like someone clinging to a cliff before falling. But the truth didn't let her go. The truth pulled her down. Richard nodded. "Do not soften it. Say it outright." The manager inhaled, then read the findings, as if reciting the verdict of a disciplinary council. Intentional destruction of a passenger's property, security endangerment, verbal harassment driven by personal prejudice, inciting panic with false information, abuse of authority, attempting to have a passenger restrained without grounds, and live streaming to provoke public reaction. Passengers shuddered. Each charge hit the air like a sledgehammer. Linda trembled under the weight of them, looking as if she were being interrogated under a burning spotlight. Marcus watched without blinking, not cold but condemning. A witness, a force compelling the entire cabin to confront the truth. A young man in row 5 spoke quietly, but the entire cabin heard him. If he weren't a CEO, he would be in handcuffs right now. A heavy silence rolled across the room. No one disagreed. Because it was the truth. The truth everyone knew, but never dared to speak aloud. Linda gasped for breath. She gripped the seat so hard that her nails bent and cracked against her skin, turning red. But no words could rescue her from what was coming. The manager handed the iPad to Richard, showing a clip. The moment Linda kicked Marcus's suitcase. The sharp impact echoed through the cabin again. Several passengers flinched, hearing it replayed. Another clip showed her live streaming, calling Marcus a threat. Another showed him standing still, completely calm, a striking contrast to Linda's aggression. Richard's eyes darkened as he finished watching. He handed the iPad toward Marcus. "Do you want to see it?" Marcus shook his head. "I lived it. I do not need to watch it again." Linda opened her mouth. "Marcus, please. I did not know who you." Marcus turned his gaze, compressing into something sharp as forged steel. "You did not need to know who I am to treat me like a human being. You kicked my suitcase because you believed you had the right. You tore my documents because you thought no one would stand up. You called security because you believed your word was always the truth. You are not sorry for what you did. You are sorry you were caught." Linda froze. Every excuse inside her died instantly. A security officer stepped up, folder in hand. "Given the severity of the situation, we will proceed with detainment for further investigation. If the passenger wishes, we can escalate the file to federal authorities." Marcus looked at the officer, then at Linda. His eyes didn't show hatred. Only a cold truth. She was the product of a system that convinced her she was untouchable. She was wrong. And the price was real. At that moment, a boy around 8 years old in row 4 whispered to his mother softly enough that only those nearby heard. "Mum, why did she do that to him?" The mother held her child close, her voice trembling. "Because sometimes adults forget they are supposed to be kind. But today, remember this: the truth always wins." Marcus heard it. He turned away immediately, not wanting anyone to see the flicker of emotion behind the calm steel of his expression. He was not weak, but children's questions had a way of touching the places adults tried to hide. A manager directed the officers, "Escort Flight Attendant Carver to stand." Linda could not stand on her own. 2 officers had to lift her. Her eyes were swollen, but no more tears came. She had cried herself empty, or fear had frozen every drop left. Richard spoke without looking at her, as though she no longer existed in his mind. "Ms. Carver, locker key, security badge, airline insignia." "Now." Linda handed them over with shaking hands. The clink of metal filled the cabin like the snap of a chain breaking, but it did not signify freedom. It marked the end. Richard turned to another manager. "Prepare the termination file. Send it today, and contact Human Resources to review the entire complaint history associated with Ms. Carver." Linda tried to speak, but the officer signaled, "Let's go." She was escorted down the aisle between rows of silent passengers. No one wished her luck. No one asked for leniency. No one felt sympathy. They watched her like watching the shadow of abused power finally being dragged into the light. When the last row swallowed her silhouette, no one exhaled. Richard turned back toward Marcus, his voice heavy, deep, and trembling with contained outrage. "Marcus, I will not let today be buried in an internal report. I am reopening every complaint ignored over the past 20 years. Marcus answered his voice, low and solid like steel under the aircraft floor. "Not for me. For the people who never had a voice." Richard held his gaze for a long moment. "You will have everything you need to make that happen." Marcus did not nod, did not thank him, did not savor a victory. He looked toward the exit where Linda had disappeared, and everyone understood what he was thinking. This fight is no longer his alone. It has become a battle against a system, and Linda was only the surface. The airline's legal team entered the cabin like a panel of judges who carried not gavels but authority. They did not look at the passengers. They did not look at the crew. Their eyes locked straight onto Marcus, as if the entire crisis of the airline revolved around the man standing calmly in the aisle, a calm so controlled it made the entire system tread lightly. A middle-aged attorney stepped forward, his voice low, clear, direct. Hail, we intend to confirm the full scope of Flight Attendant Carver's misconduct and file an official report with the Federal Aviation Security Committee. But before we proceed, I want to ask, do you have any specific requests for how this should be handled? The air tightened like a drawn bowstring. The young manager nearby swallowed hard. Passengers held their breath. The crew bowed their heads. That question was no longer a formality. It was an admission that Marcus had enough weight to shape how an entire airline would be judged. Marcus looked at the attorney, then at the whole cabin. His voice was deep sharp, carrying a quiet power that made every spine stiffen. What I want is not someone being fired, not an apology, not compensation. I want this system to understand the consequences of giving authority to someone who does not know how to use it. Another attorney asked, his voice trembling slightly. To what extent do you want this addressed? Marcus answered without hesitation. Completely. A ripple of whispers swept through the cabin. A woman raised her hand to her mouth. An elderly passenger gave a subtle nod, as if affirming a verdict long overdue. Meanwhile, Grace, the young flight attendant who had dared to tell the truth, stood frozen, her eyes glistening, not with fear, but with something she never expected to witness justice. Richard motioned for the legal team to step back, then took one decisive step forward. Marcus, be specific. The airline will carry out everything you request. Marcus straightened his voice, lowering not angry, but sharp like a scalpel cutting into the rot of the problem. I want every complaint ignored in the past 20 years reviewed. I want every case dismissed, minimized, or buried under false reports reopened. I want the people who were treated the way I was treated, even if they had no name, no status, no voice, to be publicly cleared. And I want the entire process overseen by an independent authority. A few passengers instinctively clapped before stopping themselves, unsure if they were crossing a line. But their eyes could not hide it, glowing with recognition, looking at Marcus as though they were witnessing a declaration carved into the very walls of the cabin. Richard adjusted his collar, then nodded once, heavy and decisive. Agreed. I will sign the enforcement order as soon as we leave this aircraft. Linda, standing behind two officers, heard every word. Each of Marcus's demands struck her mind like a hammer. She understood now that this had gone far beyond one flight attendant being disciplined. She had ignited an investigation that could expose the dark corners the industry had kept hidden for years. But Marcus was not finished. He turned to Richard, his eyes locked on him without blinking. I want the entire staff retrained. Not a few workshops. Real training. Cultural reform. I want employees to understand that a uniform is not a weapon, and authority is not a license to degrade another human being. The entire cabin looked at Marcus as though he were rewriting the rules of an entire industry. Richard responded without hesitation. We will launch a national training program. Not short-term. It'll be long-term and mandatory. I emphasize mandatory. Marcus studied him, searching for the truth behind the promise. When he saw the resolve in Richard's eyes, sharp and genuine, he finally gave a small nod. The lead officer repeated the procedure. Mr. Hale, we will escort Flight Attendant Carver now. She will be interrogated, and her file will be reviewed for federal charges. Linda gasped, as if the air around her had turned to stone. Marcus looked at her one last time. That look stripped her of all words. It was not hatred, not revenge. It was the truth reflected in the eyes of a man she had tried to drag into destruction, only to discover she was the one falling. Two officers placed gentle hands on her arms. She flinched, choking on her breath, then was led down the aisle. With each step, she took not a single passenger turned away. They watched, not to punish her, but to witness the end she had created herself. Grace watched with her hands clasped tight. chest rising and falling, not out of pity, but because she understood this moment would change her life and the lives of people like her. Richard turned back to Marcus. "What do you need next?" Marcus exhaled slowly, deeply, releasing a weight he had carried not only for himself, but for all the silent ones before him. "For now, I just need to stand here, because what comes next does not come from me." As if triggered by those words, a voice rose from the front row. "I will testify." The passenger in 2A spoke his tone, carrying the weight of someone who had lived long enough to know when it was time to stand up. Row 3 joined. "So will I." A young woman raised her voice, trembling but determined. "I am sending my video right now." Another passenger added, "Me too." Then, one by one, voices joined a domino effect of truth. No order was given. No call was made. But what is right always finds its way forward. Marcus stood at the center of the cabin, saying nothing. He did not need to. Because the passengers, the very people who had been silent at the beginning, now stood up not because of him, but because they finally understood something greater. Justice does not begin with a system. It begins with a single person who dares to say no. One of the security officers stepped out of the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. The fading echo of Linda's footsteps as she was led off the aircraft reverberated through the silence, growing distant, then disappearing around the bend of the jet bridge. No one followed. No one called after her. No one looked down. But everyone felt it clearly. Her disappearance was not an ending, but the beginning of a shockwave radiating beyond this plane, reaching straight into the core of an entire industry. Marcus stood alone in the aisle, yet he did not look alone. He stood tall, breath steady, like someone who had just walked out of a trial by fire, not burned, but reforged. The cabin lights cut across his face in sharp lines, making him look like a figure stepping out of a final judgment. Richard Coleman walked toward him, stopping at a respectful distance. He no longer needed to apologize. He had done so through action. Now he stood as someone ready to listen. Marcus looked at him, his voice low but resonant, each word sounding carved in metal. "I know today was not the fault of one person. I saw their faces. Fear, silence, confusion, resignation. They are used to not intervening, used to assuming the uniform equals the truth." Richard nodded heavily. "You are right," Marcus continued. "But the truth does not come from a uniform. It comes from action, from people who choose to say enough." The passengers who heard him fell still as if his words had turned a light toward their own reflections. Some lowered their heads. Some looked at Marcus with a new kind of respect. A businessman in the front row spoke, his voice thick with remorse. "I have flown thousands of times. I have seen this happen to others, but I never stood up. Today I am ashamed of that." Marcus turned to him. "Today you did stand up, and that matters more than all the times you stayed silent before." A young woman spoke up, her voice trembling. "We need people like you. People who speak. People who challenge what the rest of us have allowed to slide for too long." Marcus shook his head, but not to refuse. "I do not need admiration. I need change." Richard stepped forward as if committing himself to carry that weight. "You will have it. I promise." A young airline employee, someone who had not dared look at Marcus since the incident began, suddenly stepped out. His hands were clasped tightly, his voice shaking but sincere. "I want to apologize for not speaking sooner. I knew what she did was wrong. But I was afraid of losing my job, afraid she would report me, afraid of everything. But when I saw you stand there, I realized how cowardly I was." Marcus looked at him directly, not with anger, but with a truth sharper than any reprimand. "You were not cowardly. You simply had never seen someone stand first. Now you have, and you will be the one who stands for others." That is how change happens. The young employee inhaled deeply and lifted his head, completely transformed. In that moment, he no longer looked like a trembling staff member. He looked like someone who had just regained his backbone. From the back of the cabin, a deep, steady voice rose like a judge striking a gavel. "Mr. Hale, if there is any investigation that requires witnesses, I will step forward. No anonymity. No fear." Another voice followed. "Me too." Another. "Count me in." And another. And another. Every voice that rose shattered a piece of the silence that had defined the morning. They were no longer people avoiding eye contact. They were becoming voluntary witnesses of justice. Marcus looked across the cabin, his gaze moving slowly, deeply, warmly. Not a soft warmth, but the warmth of strength of leadership. He spoke loudly enough for all to hear, but low enough to resonate. "Today you didn't stand for me. You stood for everyone who never had the chance to stand where I am. You stood for those mistreated on flights before this one. You broke the silence that the system relied on to survive. And you proved that justice is not the story of one person. It is the story of a community. Passengers did not clap. They did not cheer. No one dared break the gravity of the moment. They simply stood firm. And this silence was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of awakening. Richard stepped beside Marcus, ready to declare a change larger than himself. "From this moment forward, I promise all of you, this airline will never allow this to happen again." Marcus looked straight ahead, not bowing, not smiling. He spoke one sentence, sounding like a command addressed to the sky itself. "Then begin today." And everyone understood this was no longer a conflict between a flight attendant and a passenger. This was the beginning of a reform, a movement, a seismic shift radiating beyond the aircraft door, reaching into the entire system. And they, the witnesses, had just become part of that history. A long silence opened so deep, it felt as if the heartbeat of every person in the cabin could be heard. No more crying, no more whispering, no more footsteps of Linda being escorted away. Only the steady hum of the air system remained drifting across the ceiling, like the quiet exhale of the aircraft itself after witnessing the storm that had unfolded inside it. Richard received an urgent call through his earpiece. He listened for a few seconds, his expression tightening, before he looked toward Marcus. "The Federal Air Security Agency has confirmed they received the report. They are sending federal officers to assess the violations of Flight Attendant Carver and the airline itself." The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion, but the weight of truth being acknowledged by a higher system. Marcus stood with his back straight, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. He did not look pleased or relieved. He knew federal involvement was not a victory. It was the inevitable consequence of truth pushed to its breaking point. A passenger, a black doctor in his 40s, rose to his feet. "Mr. Hale, I have been through something similar. Not as severe as today, but the insinuations were there. I stayed silent, and I regretted it. Today I thank you for not being silent for people like me." Marcus looked at him, his eyes deep, softening slightly. "You do not need to regret it. The system made you silent, but truth made you stand. And today you stood." A middle-aged woman beside the doctor, spoke up her voice, trembling, yet resolute. "I want to support any reform you propose. I think many of us here feel the same." Richard heard this, and his face grew even more solemn. He understood when passengers stand together, this is no longer a public relations issue. This is the sign of a large-scale investigation taking shape. The attorney opened his laptop again, his tone formal and urgent. "Mr. Hale, we propose a press briefing right here at the gate, not to defend ourselves, but to publicly announce the reform commitments. The airline will take responsibility, but if you agree to stand with us, the impact will be far greater." Several passengers looked toward Marcus, waiting, but Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the stack of documents at his feet, papers, once representing a $500 million contract, now creased, torn, marked by a shoe print. He bent down, gathering each page with slow, deliberate care, as if collecting fragments of the story he had been forced to live. When he stood upright, the cabin seemed to stretch tighter. Then he spoke. "I will not attend a press briefing meant to salvage an airline's reputation. I will only stand there if that briefing acknowledges those who were treated as I was. If it speaks for them, honors them, clears their names, and if it launches real reform, not hollow promises." Richard did not hesitate. Agreed. "I will draft the statement now. We will bring everything into the light." Marcus looked directly into his eyes, unwavering. "I want every word of that briefing verified. I want every commitment recorded. I want every reform assigned with a deadline. I want the truth, not just spoken, but protected." Richard responded with the voice of a man who knew he had found the right ally to change an entire system. "You will have all of it." A loud announcement echoed from outside the female voice, crisp and steady. "Federal security forces are approaching the gate. Passengers, please remain in your seats." The cabin held its breath. Not from fear, from the realization that they were about to become witnesses in an investigation that might be broadcast nationwide. Grace stepped forward, standing close to Marcus, as if wanting to say something. She paused for half a second, took a breath, then spoke just loud enough for him to hear, though her voice carried faintly through the cabin. "Thank you for saying what we couldn't say." Marcus looked toward the open door where federal officers were about to enter. He spoke without looking at Grace, but his voice carried a weight that sent a chill through her. "I am not speaking for anyone. I am speaking the truth the system should have spoken long ago." The sound of federal boots thundered through the jet bridge. Quick, heavy, decisive. Passengers straightened. The crew held their breath. The management team stood rigid like defendants, awaiting the verdict of a court. A federal officer appeared at the door, black jacket badge gleaming under the cabin lights. His gaze swept the scene like an X-ray, cutting through every excuse. He spoke the first sentence, his voice low, authoritative, leaving no room for interpretation. "Who is Marcus Hale?" Every pair of eyes in the cabin turned to him. Marcus did not step forward. He did not raise his hand. He simply stood tall, and his presence alone told the officer who he was. The officer nodded, once then spoke the second sentence. "Mr. Hale, the federal investigation is officially underway. No one in first class yet understood that what they were about to witness would change more than an airline. It would reach the entire system, the entire aviation industry, the nation itself, and it all began with the moment one man stood before injustice and did not step back." From the perspective of an expert in systemic justice, the story of Marcus Hale does more than expose the abuse of power by one individual. It reveals how a flawed structure can turn silence into a weapon that destroys people. True strength does not lie in status, but in the ability to force an entire system to confront itself through unwavering resolve and dignity. If you believe that truth must be protected through clear action and courageous voices, please like and subscribe to help spread these values, and leave a comment with the phrase "Stand Up" to show that you choose to stand on the side of justice.